do have this question in my mind of like, when does the novelty of first, or when could the novelty of first become something normal? You know, where it's like, it's not such a novel thing to have a Korean American woman or an Asian American woman leading a church.
Welcome to Religion Unmuted, where we're exploring what religion sounds like with women's voices turned up. I'm your host, Elaine Howard-Eklund. I'm a sociologist and director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Today we're going to be talking about women who are religious leaders. Specifically, we'll address the unique struggles and contributions of women who are religious leaders and talk a little bit more about why there aren't more of them. Our guest today is the Reverend Christine Lee. Since 2019, she has been priest in charge at St. Peter's Episcopal Church, located in the Chelsea neighborhood of New York City. Thank you, Christine. I feel a little bit funny calling you that when you have all those titles, but just so our listeners know, Christine and I have been friends for a while, and it's been my privilege to know her both as a friend and to learn about her professional work. We are so honored that you're joining us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
You're known for being the first Korean American woman ordained by the Episcopal Church, was one of the things you're known for. And then being the first ever woman of any racial location to lead the historic St. Peter's Church in Chelsea. Am I saying Chelsea correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. I am not a native New York City person. I'm actually from, as you know, but our listeners don't know, from rural upstate New York. And so I always, when I see that word on paper, I'm always like, am I saying that right? So maybe if you could just speak a little bit to the idea of power in the firsts. You know, is there power in these firsts? Do these firsts, in quotes, ever frustrate you? Are they challenging? Maybe tell us a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, well, it's funny because when the idea of being the first in those ways that you name comes up, I never think about it on a day-to-day level.
Yeah,
it only ever comes up in introductions or in bios. And so, you know, most of the time I'm just operating as myself and just trying to be a good priest. But I think where I've encountered it more is in how other people respond to me. So, for example, you know, I think of at my ordination service, I remember there was a woman who had attended that service, and I didn't even know her, but she had heard about me and knew people who knew me. And she had grown up in a denomination that did not ordain women, but had always had that longing for that. And she told me later, after we met and got to know each other, she said, I sat in the back of the sanctuary and I just cried the entire time. I think women like her, as well as like parents, I feel like often will bring that up because they will say things like, it means so much to me that my child will grow up like not thinking it's strange to have a woman who's their priest. So I think in that way, the impact of being able to have show a different face to the priesthood and to religious leadership, I think there's power in that. I do have this question in my mind of like, when does the novelty of first, or when could the novelty of first become something normal? You know, where it's like, it's not such a novel thing to have a Korean American woman or an Asian American woman leading a church. And sometimes I'm challenged myself in what I think of as being normal. So like, for example, in New York City, there are many churches that have all male pastoral staffs, and we don't think twice about that. But this is the first time I think St. Peter's has ever had like an all-female pastoral staff. And that can be seen as sort of a novel or a strange thing. But I know I kind of long for a time when we don't even really think about it.
Yeah. That one thing, just to clarify, people's background experiences are really different, of course. And so maybe tell our listeners who don't know why, you know, a church wouldn't allow women in leadership, like what the doctrinal position perhaps is, I don't know how you put it, is. And then I'm also wondering how you respond to that. You know, maybe you in larger pastoral circles, you might encounter folks who find it hard or problematic in some way, and how you respond to that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there are a number of churches and denominations that believe that based on the teaching of Scripture, there is what's often referred to as complementarianism, and this idea that, God created human beings as male and female, and that there's something essential in the created order of things where men are called to lead and women are called to submit to that leadership. And so the Apostle Paul in the New Testament will talk a lot about the headship of men and how women should not teach or have authority over men. So how that plays out in different churches can look different, but the general idea is that in the church and in the home, that men have a prescribed leadership role and women are there to kind of quote unquote complement that leadership in different ways. But yeah, in terms of how I respond when I encounter that, it's funny. Like sometimes like my husband Jimmy gets more angry about it when he encounters that position than I do. I don't necessarily feel like I get angry about it, but I just by the way that I'm wired, I tend to be really empathetic. Like I understand people who think differently. So when I think about Scripture, if you're reading Scripture through a certain lens, I'm like, I can totally see how you would get to that position. Yeah, there's that verse in there that says women should not teach or have authority over men. But I don't think that's the only way to read Scripture. And I also don't think that those are the only scriptures or the only verses that are in the Bible. And so I bring my own interpretive lens to the way that I read and understand men and women's roles in the church. So, to be quite honest, like in the circles that I run in, like I just don't have to encounter that very often. And so, yeah, in fact, more often it comes up primarily when there are women who are attending churches that are more traditional in their understanding of gender roles who will come to me to ask me, so, what should I do or how should I think about this? And I tend to tell them either like one of two things. One is, okay, well, if you feel strongly about this and you're not in a church that's really affirming, and unless you feel like you're really called to stay and be that voice or challenge the powers that be, then I would suggest that maybe you go somewhere else, that does affirm that. But if you don't feel that, then just know that you're probably in it for the long haul and that it will be frustrating and it will be challenging. And I think that it's important to feel a sense of calling to that.
That's a really interesting point. At what point do you, as a woman leader, try to change structures? And yeah. I want to say hang in there, but that makes it sound like that's the right thing to do, right?
Right. Yeah.
Or do you, go someplace else, right? That's more affirming of those particular gifts of you as a woman leader. I know a lot of women ask me that as well. And I wonder, how you think about that kind of discernment. What are some principles of discernment as how I might put it, where one would know what to do?
Yeah. I don't know that I necessarily have like a easy answer for that, other than I think having conversations with people, obviously prayer and seeking God and really what you sense God is calling you to. I think for me personally, like I kind of came to a point where I don't know, sometimes I can feel a little impatient with the conversation where I'm like, like you can have that conversation if you want to, but I kind of feel like I just want to do the work and kind of get my hands dirty. And I spent about 2 years overseas as a short-term missionary in Thailand. And I remember and I think in that setting where the mission is the most important thing, that there's a certain all hands on deck mentality about it, where you feel like, okay, we don't have time to be arguing about who's a man, who's a woman, who should be doing what. It's like, we need you. If you have a gift, we need you, and just use it, for the kingdom of God. But I appreciate the conversation that you and I are having right now, and I think it's important. But in terms of for most of my time and energy, I'm kind of I have so many other things I have to think about and worry about and talk about.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and being a priest, especially, oh my gosh, in these times, in these pandemic times, in these times of so much needed discussion around issues of racial justice and just to pick and choose. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what is really worthy? What's the best use? Not worthy, but what's really the best use of our time right now? I find that so hard myself.
Yeah.
You've written quite a bit and spoken about this normative idea of what it means to be a good Christian and how that can be very overwhelmingly white and male notion of that. And can you elaborate on what that looks like in the church, maybe your church, and share what it would look like in your mind to just start to begin to dismantle that idea?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I think about the places that I have been formed and trained at, particularly in my younger years, it's a very, I think it's an ethos that's marked by, just Western individualism, for one. And then I think very Enlightenment defined, if that makes sense. So the whole, I think, therefore I am. And so it's very much about the intellect and your rationale as being the most important thing. So for example, inductive Bible study and exegesis of Greek and Hebrew. Not that those things aren't important, but it's that's the most important thing, your questions. And so I think it's sort of Enlightenment defined, I think kind of corporate culture driven in some ways, where I always say, one of the questions that just drives me nuts when pastors get together is whether it's what's the win? What's the win in this?
Do you mean for, if I may, do you mean for the, what's the, are they saying what's the, this technique or whatever, what's the win for the church? What does the church get out of it? What do I get out of it?
Yeah, exactly. It's as we do this particular ministry initiative, what's the win? How are we going to know that we're really successful in this? And but it's often very sort of numbers driven, whether it's people or money, everything is very much about how do I see this particular tangible outcome that shows that I am successful. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it can tap into this, I think what can be an idolatry, not just in Christian circles, just sort of in American society, this idolatry of success and numbers and the bigness of things and how many people do you have coming to your church and all of that. So I think in my mind, particularly as a religious leader,
that's right.
There's this sort of kind of pastor as CEO, general, kind of rock star. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Rock star.
Cowboy. That sort of alpha male visionary. And that was always set up as this ideal that everyone was always trying to aspire to. And I'm neither alpha or a male. I'm trying to be and failing miserably and feeling like both a terrible Christian and a terrible leader and often disqualified myself, as a result of that.
Yeah. This is, our privilege, right? Is I'm the person interviewing you. So I've had all this time to read your stuff recently, which has really been a privilege, but I wrote it down here in this 2016 series for Inheritance Magazine. You wrote of your younger mindset. In my mind, a reverend is a man and I am not a man. Therefore, I should not be a reverend. Mm-hmm. And I think that's, we're kind of touching on that a little bit right now. And you said you had to go almost into a kind of unconditioning and unlearning to get from that point to where you are today. Yeah.
Yeah. And so much of that, what I wrote was due to the fact I didn't grow up with pastors who were women. My father is a pastor.
Okay.
Yeah. And he's very actually affirming of women, but I still never saw women in those roles. And so, I think in terms of unlearning it, it's been a number of things. One has been, as I've been just kind of growing in my own relationship with God and trying to be who God has called me to be and embrace the gifts that God has given me and just who I am and seeing that not as being a liability or less than, but that there's a faithfulness to being who God's called me to be. I think there's some story, I'm going to get this wrong, but where it was something there was a rabbi named Zusa, and before he died, he said something when I get to heaven and I see God, he's not going to ask me, why were you not more like Moses, but why were you not more like Zusa? And that story always stuck with me. I was why am I trying to be, these leaders that I see that I know that I'm not? And so I think some of it has just been trying to embrace who I am and how God's created me to be and see that as a gift. But, honestly, community has been probably like the most key thing for me. So it was one, being in the church that I was at, All Angels, which is the first Episcopal church that I was ever a part of, and being in a church where women were affirmed as leaders. And when we didn't really talk about it, it was just there. Like I saw women leading at every single level. There was a female priest that was there who was the associate. So I think being exposed to that for the very first time in this very natural and organic way, and then people seeing things in me that I could not see in myself and affirming things in me that I couldn't affirm in myself. So when I went through, in the Episcopal Church, they call it the discernment process. So essentially when someone is thinking about being ordained, there's a group of people who walk with them to pray with them and discern with them. And that committee was so helpful to me because they helped me to see, okay, Christine, your dad is this really sort of famous Korean pastor, and he really has formed your image of what it means to be a pastor. And you're not that. And so you feel like, who am I? But being a priest is really ultimately about creating a space for people to encounter the risen Christ. And you can do that in so many different ways, and you're going to do that in the way that you do. And then having a community that was not only affirming that in me, but then inviting me to actually step out and use my gifts and be able to kind of try on the role in some sense, and show me a lot of grace in the process. I feel like I was able to see things about myself and experience things about myself that, like, in another community, I just would not have been able to. So I feel grateful to them.
That's an incredible example. And I find myself wanting to name some things you've said so that our listeners are sure to pick it up. So seeing role models of women leading seems really important. So if I wanted to increase the possibility of women being in leadership, I should try to make sure there are role models. Mm-hmm. And then you talked about having a group of people who are calling out your gifts as a woman. And I'm wondering, how could we apply that more widely, and are there other things we can do to encourage women who are in leadership of religious organizations and of churches in particular?
Yeah, well, it makes me reflect on how, now that I am in the role that I'm in, because I, in many ways, am not a quote unquote traditional leader, and hence never felt like I had anything to bring to the role of leadership. I think being able to create those opportunities for others, and in how I see even the people in my own congregation or in the people that I meet, being able to not only model a different way of leading just by being who I am, but also being able to, and I don't know, maybe that has given me a greater sensitivity towards seeing just the way that other people are wired and the way that they're gifted, and be able to expand my perspective of what it even means to be a leader. And I think that those of us who hold leadership positions, we have that task and that responsibility to not have such a narrow view of what it looks like to be a leader. And it's funny because I even have my own blind spots. There was this one time where we were having this luncheon for people who were interested in the ordination process. And I started to write down this list of names. And as I wrote down this list of names, I was like, almost everyone on this list is like a young white guy in their 20s and 30s. And I was like, I am a woman who is ordained, and a woman of color who's ordained. Surely I know other women or other people of color who God could potentially be calling to the priesthood. And then I realized that the reason why I listed those people was oftentimes those folks had already approached me. They took the initiative with me to say, hey, I'm interested in doing this. The way that I was ordained, I was not thinking about it at all. And it was my priest who approached me because he said, hey, I see something in you, and invited me into that. But then while I was writing out that list, I did this little mental trick in my mind. And I thought to myself, okay, if this woman in my congregation was a man, would I have added her to this list? And when I just did that little mental trick, strangely enough, I was like, I probably would have invited her. And so even for someone like me, I have this sort of image in my mind of what I think a leader looks like. So I have to constantly be challenging myself as well.
Yeah, you're really touching on something that I think is so important for us as a society and us in churches to think about the consequences of the lack of women leaders. We think of increasing equity and access to leadership as a matter of justice or something that's theologically right, but we can also think about it as a need and think in terms of what do we lose when those women are not called. That's a great point.
Yeah, exactly. Like when I think about the women that I have known and women who have been role models for me and the women that in my church even now are on my staff team, and just try to imagine them not being there or them not being in the places that they are in. And it's like the congregation, the larger church is so much more poorer and I think malnourished as a result, would be much poorer and malnourished as a result of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really well put. They're missing out. I wonder too, just if you can share with folks a little bit about some of the challenges of being a priest during a pandemic. And are there ways in which being a woman has played into how you approach these challenges? Or you also confront me. Maybe that's not the right question to be asking. Maybe we ought to be asking a different question.
Yeah, in terms of some of the challenges, some of the obvious challenges are the thing that priests and pastors do is we gather people physically, whether it's in worship or in small groups or meeting with people one-on-one or visiting with people, and to not be able to do that, it's almost like, well, what do I do now? And so just the challenge, that's very challenging. Obviously, with all that's going on not only with COVID, but with sort of all the racial unrest, like these huge earth-shattering kind of crises that are happening, and to not be able to physically be together and gather together to kind of support and process in the ways we normally do, at least, is enormously challenging. But I would say too, another challenge is, priests are human too, and there's our own kind of just stress and anxiety in the midst of it all. And I think being able to kind of deal with that and manage that as you're also trying to minister to people who are carrying the stress and anxiety and fear and grief and all of that as well has been hard. And I keep hearing about friends who are dropping out of the ministry or having their own kind of mental and emotional breakdowns. And that's, I think, just very, very real. But I think, too, there's also a lot of opportunity in the midst of it as well. Like, I think crisis has a way of spurring sort of innovation and creativity and thinking outside of the box. In some ways, you kind of have nothing to lose. And so it's been a time of a lot of experimentation and like throwing spaghetti on the wall and seeing what sticks and discovering things that, like, I think in normal, quote unquote, normal times, like we would have not have discovered. And there's been a lot of like unexpected grace and joy in the midst of a really, really hard season. It's like the conditions are really, I think, ripe for leading in this, at least for me, like leading in this particular way in a moment like this.
Mm-hmm. That's really great. But are there any resources that you think would be good for, women who are interested in entering pastoral leadership, or are there people you're reading, or just maybe think I'm an academic, so I think in terms of books only. But are there other kinds of resources that you might suggest to folks?
Yeah, let's see. I would say that I think particularly if you're the kind of person who has not been exposed to women in leadership, I think being able to seek out and listen to women pastors or women preachers and being able to just hear voices that you may not normally listen to. And I think there's a lot of them out there. Like in anything, I think being able to like step outside of the kind of the people you listen to or the books you listen to or those perspectives that you always listen to, and being able to seek out other voices, I think are really important. But I think, podcasts like this are really important where you are amplifying women's voices. So.
Wow. Thank you for saying that. You don't know how much that means to us. That's something that Pamela and I have really wanted to do with Religion Unmuted, is to provide people with voices they may not hear always, voices that women's voices that perhaps have not been amplified enough. And thank you more broadly. Just thank you for all that you've said. This was really terrific, and thank you for who you are.
Yeah, it was great talking with you. Yeah.
Well, that's it for this episode of Religion Unmuted. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe to, rate, and review us wherever you listen. Follow us on Twitter at RiceRPLP. And thanks to our guest, Reverend Christine Lee. Today's show was written by Pamela Prickett, Rachel Schneider, Haley Hemstreet, and myself. Our producers are 3 Wire Creative and Daisha Clay. We had support from the Henry Luce Foundation. I'm Elaine Howard Eklund. Until next time.